If we understand that God isn't just the title of God in our life, but we realize the title is Abba, Father. The word Abba means daddy. When we go through rough times, sometimes you just need daddy. That's the side of him that you need. So when you're going through those hard times, asking why God, those hard times is why we need him. We need that part of who God is. That's an incredible song. Thank you, Amy. If you have your Bibles, if you'll turn to Acts chapter 10 with me this morning. A lot of times when we think about the disciples and who the disciples were, we look at their lives and their stories and we see them in the light of the New Testament era. We think that they should have complete understanding of law versus grace because they're in the New Testament books. We think that they should have a complete grasp on the will of God since it was shown to them through Jesus Christ. The 12 disciples, you think, those guys should really have it down. They should really understand what's going on. But then there's times when you read their stories and it just doesn't seem like they're getting it. I mean, they're talking to God himself. God is walking and talking with them, and they're just not getting it. They're just missing it. I love the fact that God reveals the growing process that they had to go through. These are 12 guys, and they need to grow. They need to grow. They had tender hearts, and they were very teachable, but they still had to learn like the rest of us. They still had to grow. They still had to learn. And even when God is right there with them for those years that Jesus walked and talked with them during his ministry, they still needed to learn. They still needed to grow. They were us. They were still us. They were just these guys that needed God's help. Peter is one of the disciples that God focuses a lot of his attention on. And if you think about who Peter was, you understand why God needed to focus a lot of his attention on this young man. Peter was that guy that just stepped forward. Let's just help you out. He did the false start in the game. He moved before he should have. He was supposed to just stand in line and wait, but a lot of times he jumped the gun and he did not wait. Even after Jesus ascended up to heaven, we have a few stories about Peter trickling through here and there. And in Acts chapter 10, we have a story that includes Peter, but this story, we are introduced to a very elite character whose name is Cornelius. And I want to talk about this guy this morning. Acts chapter 10, we'll start in verse 1. It says, there was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of what was called the Italian regiment, a devout man and one who feared God with all of his household, who gave his alms generously to the people and prayed to God always. About the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly an angel of God coming in and saying to him, Cornelius. And when he observed him, he was afraid and said, What is it, Lord? So he said to him, Your prayers and your alms have come up for a memorial before God. Cornelius is a centurion of the Italian regiment. Centurion means captain over 100 men. So this guy's pretty high ranking. He's a man who loves God and he takes care of other people. And he has a good reputation among the Jews and he loves the Jewish Messiah. But there's only one problem with this whole picture. Cornelius is a Gentile. He's not a Jew, he's a Gentile. The Jewish people despised the Gentile nations. So for a Gentile centurion to have connections with the Jewish Messiah seems improper in every single way. Why do you have a connection with Jesus Christ? Why do you have a connection with the Jewish God when you are a Gentile? Everything seems wrong about this. Cornelius was battling with the dilemma and needed some guidance. And God was all over it like white on rice. Like, I see what you're going through, Cornelius. I see the struggle that you're having. You are a Gentile who is in love with a Jewish God. You are a Gentile who believes that the Word of God is true. You are faithful to God, but you are one of those dirty, rotten Gentiles. Like us in this room. We are, if you're not Jewish, you're a Gentile. That's just the way it was. So God sends an angel to talk to him, and he gives him instructions of what to do. So look at verse 5 with me in Acts chapter 10. It says, "Now send men to Joppa, and send for Simon, whose surname is Peter. He is lodging with Simon a tanner, whose house is by the sea. He will tell you what you must do." And when the angel who spoke to him had departed, Cornelius called 2 of his household servants and a devout soldier from among those who waited on him continually. So when he had explained all things to them, he sent them to Joppa. Now keep in mind, Cornelius is a Gentile centurion. Don't forget that detail. He's a Gentile centurion. An angel appears to him. Angels appearing to people happen among Jewish circles a lot, but this one's new. This is a Gentile. An angel appears to a Gentile this time. The amazing thing is that he was so close to God that he didn't even question him. An angel shows up to a Gentile and he says, "What is it? This is what I want you to do." So after the angel tells him what to do, he gathers together a few of his servants and sends them to find Peter, just like the angel told him to. "I want you to send for Peter. Go get Peter and he'll answer these questions for you." Meanwhile, back at the ranch, you've got Peter. We're going to go to the other side of this story. Remember, Peter's not in this story yet. He's still in Joppa. So now let's go over to Peter and let's see what's going on with him. In Peter's story, what we see is it's getting close to lunchtime. That's what's happening on Peter's side of the story. So let's catch it in verse 9 here. It says, "The next day, as they went on their journey and drew near the city, Peter went up on the housetop to pray about the 6th hour. Then he became very hungry and wanted to eat. But while they made ready, he fell into a trance and saw heaven open and an object like a great sheep bound at the 4 corners descending to him and let down to the earth. In it were all kinds of 4-footed animals of the earth, wild beasts, creeping things, and birds of the air. And a voice came to him, 'Rise, Peter, kill and eat.'" Peter goes up to the housetop to pray. He ends up falling into a trance where he sees a sheet coming down from heaven held by all 4 corners, and this sheet is full of all kinds of animals. This is the easiest hunting trip known to man. It is delivered right to Peter. He sees it come down, it's got all these animals, and then he hears a voice saying, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." You don't need a gun. You don't need to go search for them. You don't need to plan the day. I'm just going to drop a sheet down full of all these animals. Take what you want, Peter, and let's just go ahead and eat. Just take and eat. That's a pretty good deal. He's hungry. The food is delivered right to him, and it's his for the taking. Just, hey, there you go, Peter. You're hungry. Why don't you eat some food? But Peter suddenly becomes a picky eater. A very picky eater, and he refuses to eat. No, I don't want that. Isn't that amazing when you run into a picky eater? You do all the work, you provide it for him. Like, yeah, I don't like it. That's what Peter's doing here. He becomes a picky eater. Look at verse 14. But Peter said, "Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything common or unclean." I'm not eating that. God tells Peter to eat, and Peter says, yeah, that's not going to happen. Don't you love it when we see these stories where God says, I want you to do this, and like, yep, that's not going to happen. You'd think that people wouldn't do that to God. We do that to God. And you read it all throughout the Bible. Yeah, it's not going to happen. You see, the Jews had a certain dietary law that they followed. And they were forbidden to eat certain things. God just sent down a sheet full of forbidden food. Here you go, Peter. Just take it and eat. Now, Peter thought this was a test, and he was about to fail it. And it was. And he did. This is exactly what God's trying to show him. A sheet full of these animals that are unclean. He says, just take it and eat it, Peter. Just go ahead. Not going to happen. I'm not failing this test. No, you just did. You just failed it. Look at verse 15. And a voice spoke to him again the second time. What God has cleansed, you must not call common. This was done 3 times, and the object was taken up into heaven again. Peter found himself in the wrong by trying to stay in the right. I'm not falling for this. I know I'm not supposed to touch those things, so the answer is no. And then he hears a voice, don't you call what I have cleansed common. I can't eat, I'm never eaten anything common or unclean. Don't you call that common. How am I in the wrong? I'm trying to follow the law and I'm suddenly in the wrong. He refused to eat because of the Jewish law, but was rebuked because he called it common or unclean. At which those animals were common and unclean, according to Jewish law. Peter took a stand for what he thought was right, and then God went ahead and sat him right back down again. I will take a stand for right. Sit down, Peter. Just sit back down. Look at verse 17. Now while Peter wondered within himself what this vision which he had seen meant, behold, the men who had been sent from Cornelius had made inquiry for Simon's house and stood before the gate. And they called and asked whether Simon, whose surname was Peter, was lodging there. As Peter's sitting there wondering what in the world just happened with the whole sheet thing, like, I don't know, I got it wrong. I tried to follow the law and I got it wrong. While he's trying to figure all this stuff out, Cornelius' servants show up to meet him. Now remember, they're Gentiles. These are Gentile people. God used Jewish people to reveal himself. He did that all throughout the Bible. God spoke through the people of Israel. God worked through his people, not the Gentiles, through the Jews. God got the gospel out to the world through the Jews. He used miracles. He showed himself through his people, through the Jews, not the Gentiles. Look at verse 19. While Peter thought about the vision, the Spirit said to him, behold, 3 men are seeking you. Arise, therefore, go down and go with them, doubting nothing, for I have sent them. Peter's still trying to figure out the whole food thing, and when God interrupts him, he's sitting up there trying to figure out what in the world just happened with the whole food vision thing. What's going on here? And God interrupts and says, hey, I want you to go meet them. He tells him that he has company, and to go meet his company. Go with them. And God knows Peter so well that the next thing he says is, no doubting. Don't doubt. I know you're going to want to doubt. When you hear why those guys are here, you're going to want to doubt. But don't doubt. This is going to hit you all wrong, Peter. But don't doubt them. So Peter gets up to go see his guests, still wondering what's going on, but he's obeying. Peter is in obedience to the Lord. I'm going to obey. I'm going to try not to doubt, but none of this is making sense. Look at verse 21. Then Peter went down to the men who had been sent to him from Cornelius and said, yes, I am who you seek. For what reason have you come? And they said, Cornelius the centurion, a just man, one who fears God and has a good reputation among the nation of the Jews, was divinely instructed by a holy angel to summon you to his house and to hear words from him. This is the description they get of this Gentile guy. Peter goes down to see why he has guests, and they hit him with a load of information that seems completely impossible. A Gentile is just. Cornelius is a just man. He fears God, and he gets along well with the Jewish nation. Well, that Cornelius was divinely instructed to come see you, Peter. Divinely instructed means God spoke with a Gentile. So yeah, this just man who loves the Lord and gets along with the Jewish nation was divinely instructed to come talk to you, Peter, because you need to go tell him something. And Peter's like, I'm just trying to figure out the sheet thing. I'm still trying to figure all this out. Peter does obey. He does follow. He does obey, but he is a little bit confused. The average Jew would be doubtful of this whole situation, and that's why God says, don't doubt. I know you, Peter. First thing you're going to want to do is say, I don't think so. You need to go forward without doubting. So Peter obeys, and he makes this journey to Cornelius' house, and he begins to see what God is teaching him along the way. Along the way, Peter's starting to learn. He's starting to see what God's doing with all of this. And when he finally gets there, he sees quite a little gathering show up at Cornelius' house, waiting to meet him. Look at verse 25. It says, as Peter was coming in, Cornelius met him and fell down at his feet and worshipped him. But Peter lifted him up, saying, stand up, I myself am also a man. And as he talked with him, he went in and found many who had come together. Cornelius falls down and he shows reverence to Peter. Now remember Cornelius' mindset. I'm a Gentile. You're one of the people of God. You're a Jew. I'm just a Gentile. So he bows down and he shows reverence to Peter. Cornelius is struggling with his position concerning the will of God. He's a Gentile. He's a foreigner. He's an outcast among the Israelites. I'm looked down on. I'm just a Gentile. Then Peter tells him to stand up because they're equal. Get back up. We're on the same page here, Cornelius. I'm with you, you're with me, you're a man, I'm a man. We're equals here. That's when Peter tells him how bad this situation really is, according to the law. But there's also some good news. Peter sees Cornelius and he bows down. Peter, get back up. Get back up. I've learned a lot on this trip, Cornelius. I'm learning a lot here. You need to stand back up. Why would I stand up? I'm a Gentile, you're a Jew. Yeah, because we're the same. We're exactly the same. Look at verse 28. Peter breaks how bad this situation is to Cornelius. Then he said to them, you know how unlawful it is for a Jewish man to keep company with or go to one of another nation? But God has shown me that I shall not call any man common or unclean. I'm figuring something out here. I'm learning a lesson for myself. God showed me this vision of this food coming down, and I said, I'm not touching it because it's uncommon. God says, if I cleansed it, it is not uncommon. And now I'm coming to you, a Gentile. And on my way, I'm thinking, uncommon Gentile, unclean, oh. And I have figured something out on my way here. God has told me I should not call any man common or unclean. Peter was very judgmental about the food that was offered to him, and he turned his nose up to it because of what it was. It's unclean. This is exactly what the Jewish community did to the Gentiles. I don't like them, not because they did something wrong, but because of who they are. I don't like them because of who they are. God was teaching Peter that the family of God not only consisted of Jewish people, but people of faith from every language, every nation, and every tongue. By the way, we don't have a whole lot of Jews in this church. But you know what we do have? A lot of people who are part of the family of God. We've got a lot of people here. You're not Jews, but are you a child of God? Yes. Are you God's people? Yes. But shouldn't we be Jews to do that? No. No. Peter's learning this lesson here. It's not just Jewish people, but it's people who have believed by faith from every language, nation, and tongue. Because of Christ's sacrifice, Abraham became the father of many nations, not just one nation. That was the promise. You will be the father of many nations, not just the Jewish nation. Well, this thing's going to spread all throughout the world. That means the Gentiles are included in this plan also, always have been. It stretches all the way out to us too. Look at verse 34. It says, then Peter opened his mouth and said, in truth, I perceive that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, whoever fears him and works righteously is accepted by him. The word which God sent to the children of Israel, preaching peace through Jesus Christ, he is Lord of all. And I have figured it out. You're not common and unclean, because what he cleanses is not common and unclean. You are just as clean as I am because you have the same faith in the same person as I do. And you're welcome to the family, Cornelius. You are not lower than anybody else. We're on the same page here. Peter didn't realize it, but he had a real problem with judging others according to the law. Like, I'm not eating that meat. Why? The law says no. I said, yes. Why did the law win? I told you to eat it. You tell me no because the law says not to? How did the law end up trumping me? How did that happen? Peter is realizing, I've got a real problem here. Now, I want you to go to a Gentile's house. And I know what you're going to say, so don't doubt. I know what's in your heart, Peter. Before you open your mouth, don't doubt. Try that. Just don't doubt. Just obey. Peter's got some problems here. He judges according to the law. Here's where Peter was getting it all wrong. He was judging both the food and the Gentiles by appearance. I see what that is. I'm not doing it. I know what that is, so I'm not going there. He determined that the food was repulsive because of what it was. And he determined that Cornelius was unapproachable because of who he was. Peter's got it locked down in his mind. I'm not going to touch that, and I'm not going to go there because this is what I determine as right and wrong, and I'm going to do my best to serve God according to this, and therefore I'm not going to do what God just told me to do. Because for some reason, do we really believe that sometimes God hasn't checked in with the Bible recently? And did you forget that it says this? If God says to do it, he knows what he's talking about. We've misunderstood something. We got it wrong. He doesn't have it wrong. Now I'd like to stir the pot a little bit. I am also shocked. Peter had a problem in the category of judging. And he was definitely in the wrong. For judging Cornelius, for judging what God said to do, and no, God, I'm not doing it. If you're you're in disobedience to God because you're trying to do right, you have judged things improperly. I'm not going to do it, God, even though you told me to, because this is the way I see it. You just judged everything improperly because now you're in disobedience to what he said to do because you're trying to be in obedience to what you thought he said to do. You have judged the situation wrong. Peter's got a problem with judging here. Then we have one of the most famous verses in the Bible which appears to support this. This verse is known by both believers and unbelievers. Actually, this verse is more known by the lost world than John 3:16 is. You think John 3:16 would be the popular one, and it is popular, but this one's known even better than John 3:16. Matthew 7 verse 1. Judge not, that you be not judged. Have you heard this by people? Don't you judge me. You've heard this? Only God alone is my judge. You've heard these things. And not only from Christian circles, this is a good verse. And people use this verse all the time. In 2020, we live in a generation of people that are crying out this verse. Whether they believe in God or not, they are clinging to that verse right there. Don't you judge me. Don't judge me. We've all heard people tell us that we're not to judge them. But the question is that true? Is that true? Are we not to judge them? I mean, the verse right there says, judge not that you be not judged. So, shouldn't we not judge people? Is that true? This verse is one of the most often used verses, but it is usually used out of context. It is so far out of context. Peter's problem wasn't that he was judging, it was how he was judging. That was his problem. Jesus dealt with the same kind of problem in John when the people were judging him because he healed a man on the Sabbath day, and he got that a lot. He heals this man on the Sabbath day, and he's dealing with the same kind of problem. Look at John chapter 7 and verse 24. It says, "Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment." So the question is, are we to judge or are we not to judge? You look at it right there. Am I supposed to judge or am I supposed to not judge? It's all, and we're not even looking at two different verses. We're just looking at one. Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. To judge or not to judge? That is the question. Which one should we go with here? I often hear people say that Christians are just intolerant. You're just intolerant, and because of that, we're in direct disobedience to Matthew chapter 7 and verse 1. Don't judge. Judge not. Don't do it. We're told that we need to accept everyone and every lifestyle because if we don't do that, we're judging. And that's what we hear. You hear it on the media. You hear it in conversations at work. You might hear it among family members. Don't you judge my lifestyle. Jesus told you not to. In Matthew it says, judge not. And they love this verse. If I'm being judged, I would understand why this verse is a good one to go to. Don't judge me. Nobody wants to be judged. So this is a popular verse. Judge not. I feel that we need to bring some clarity to this verse and get it within its context. Let's find out what this verse means. Because this verse is used a lot, we should know what we should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing. Because that verse that we just looked at says, don't judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. So are we to judge or aren't we to judge? God tells us to judge, and He also tells us not to judge. It's not about judging or not judging. It's about how we are judging. It's okay to judge. Don't let that be the only thing you heard today. It is okay to judge. It is not okay to judge the wrong way. So we've got to clear this up. We've got to look at it within its context. So Matthew 7 and verse 1. Let's look at this verse again. It says, judge not that you be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. First of all, the word judgment means to condemn. That is what this word means. Condemn not. Don't condemn. It's the same word that's used in John chapter 3 and verse 17. The exact same Greek word. So let's look at that verse. John 3:17. For God did not send His Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through Him might be saved. Same word. Judge. Condemn. The irony in this is that people usually say only God can judge me, and with this definition of the word judge, God excludes Himself too. Only God can judge me. He said He didn't come to judge. In this context, in that word. Don't judge me, only God can judge me, but Jesus says He came not to judge you, but to save you. If you want to use the same word, there's two verses you can use the exact same word in. It means condemnation. He didn't come to condemn or to judge the world, He came to save the world. When we judge in condemnation, condemnation is what we get in return. Have you ever tried it? Try to condemn somebody, what happens? Comes right back. Same measure. You just get it right, it just comes right back. God is not saying not to judge. He is saying not to judge with condemnation, but to judge with righteous judgment. We are to judge. Again, don't let that be the only thing you heard today. We are to judge, but we are not to judge in condemnation. We are to judge with righteous judgment, but we are to judge. Let's look at the rest of this context of Matthew chapter 7 verse 1. Let's look at the entire context here. Verse 3 of Matthew 7. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrite! First remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. This is where the context of judge not is. The first thing I want to point out here is it says to take care of your own issue so you can see clearly to help your brother with his issue. It never says that we shouldn't address the issue, because that'll make you look intolerant. It doesn't say not to do that. Don't you talk about their sin because it'll make you look intolerant. God never said that. It never says that we cannot judge what is right and what's wrong. If it was actually saying that we shouldn't judge, how would we be able to follow God's instruction in Matthew 18:15? Let's look at this verse. Matthew 18:15. Moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you have gained your brother. According to our worldview, who are we to determine what's right and what's wrong and what sin is and what sin is not? Let me help you with this one. We aren't the one who determines right and wrong. God is. But if God says it's wrong, it's wrong. It's wrong. I'm not telling you what right and wrong is. I'm just telling you what God said right and wrong is. And by the way, it's like he's God or something. He knows. He knows. This is right, this is wrong. This will hurt you, this won't. He knows what right and wrong is. To call sin out for what it is not condemnation. And we need to understand that. To call sin out for what sin is not condemnation. It is recognizing sin for what it is. That is not condemnation. So if it's okay to judge, I think it's also important to look at how we are to be judging. How am I supposed to, if it's okay for me to judge, this is not when I run out of the building and just go around judging people. It's good to know how to do this before I go judging people. Peter was repulsed by the idea of going to a Gentile home or eating any unclean animal because he was judging with condemnation. That's judging with condemnation. That is wrong. Do not condemn. Do not judge in a condemning way. And as he's headed to Cornelius' house, he saw the error of his ways, and he ended up judging with a righteous judgment instead. Everything's turned around. Now you might think, I don't remember Peter judging again after that first time. That's because it doesn't look like that anymore. It doesn't. Now what we do, we normally define judgment as condemnation. That's why people don't want you to judge them, is because they don't want you to condemn them. But God told you not to do that. And they're absolutely right. If you are condemning them and they say judge not, they got it in context. Don't condemn me. That's not your job. You're not to condemn them. Cornelius was seeing himself as a person with very little value. He's just a Gentile. He didn't see himself as righteous and redeemed. He saw himself as a lowly Gentile in his opinion. I'm nothing. After Peter addressed the problem that he had, the problem that Peter had, after he addresses that problem, he was able to see clearly to help Cornelius with the problem he was dealing with. Before you go after the speck in your brother's eye, you need to remove the plank that's in your eye so you can see clearly to help them with the speck that's in their eye. Peter had a 2x4 hanging out of his head. He's got a plank in his own eye, and God says, you need to take the plank out, Peter. Why? Because you're so focused on the speck, and you're judging it with condemnation because you see something that shouldn't be there, but you got a big problem going on personally, Peter. You got a plank in your eye, you got to take care of that. Why? So you can see clearly. because you're just judging in condemnation right now. This passage in Matthew chapter 7 is not talking about whether or not we should judge, but what kind of judge you are. It's not talking about to judge or not to judge. It's how to judge. It's absolutely okay to judge, but there needs to be some preparation beforehand, and we must also judge in the right way. The first thing that must be done is to look at yourself. You got to look at yourself. Look at verse 5, Matthew chapter 7, verse 5. Hypocrite. Isn't that nice that he starts out like that? Hypocrite. First remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. This does not mean to make sure you are living a perfect life before you discern between right and wrong. Are you living perfectly? Nope, then you can't judge. That's not what that means. Doesn't mean that you have to have it all going on. Doesn't mean that you have to be perfect before you can identify what's right and what's wrong. It means that you should be able to see clearly enough to make that judgment call. Not that you're going to be perfect, because none of us are going to. We need Christ to come back so bad. We need him to come back. If you think you're perfect before that's going to happen, go work on that. Because you're not. You're not perfect. So it doesn't mean you have to be perfect before you can judge. It means that you need to be able to see clearly enough to make that judgment call. When you're on an airplane, a lot of times you're given instruction of what to do in an emergency situation. If the plane's going down, it doesn't really matter what you do at that point, but you can listen. If the plane's going to hit the ground, that flotation device, hang on to it for comfort. But it's not going to help once the plane hits. But if you're in an emergency situation, they might say, well, it's not going to hit the ground, but there's a chance. The cabin pressure might change, something like that. So in an emergency situation, these are the things that you hear. You're told that an oxygen mask might fall down. And when that thing falls down, you are told to put that thing on. Now, the instructions seem a little bit weird at this point. You're told not to help the person next to you. That's the first thing they tell you. The oxygen mask is going to fall. When you see that, don't help the person next to you. Don't do that. Isn't that very unselfish sounding? It says, don't help them. Why do they say don't help the person next to you? It's not that they don't want you to help them. It says you got to do something first. Make sure the oxygen mask is on you before you help the person next to you. Because if you're in the middle of helping that person and things change where you pass out, now there's two people that can't breathe. Now there's two people that aren't able to live because you didn't follow the instructions. The first thing you need to do is make sure you're equipped to help the person next to you. You can't just run and go help them. Don't just run and get the speck out of their eye. First, get the plank out of your own eye so you can see clearly enough to help the person with the speck in their eye. Make sure you can function before you help the person next to you, because when you're done, if you haven't removed the problem you've got, you're both in a problem. You're both in a situation where you can't move forward. This is what verse 5 is talking about. First, remove the plank from your own eye, that you may see clearly enough to help remove the speck from your brother's eye. Make sure you're doing what you need to do before you run around helping everybody else. We're to speak the truth, but we are to speak the truth in love. It's okay to speak the truth. It's not condemnation to call sin out for what it is. Otherwise, my line of work, I'm in a bad place. Because I will call sin out for what it is, not because I determined what was right and wrong, but because God's Word determines what's right and wrong. Judging itself is not the problem here. It's when your heart changes towards that person because of that judgment. This is when we made the same error that Peter made. I can't stand that person. Why? Because look at the sin they're in. That's what Jesus told you not to do. That's condemnation. That's the wrong judging. If you see someone who's been overtaken with a sin, it's wrong to see them with condemnation. It's wrong. When Jesus saw you in your sin, did he come to condemn the world? Did he come to judge you like? No, he says, I didn't come to condemn you. I came to save you. That's what I'm asking you to do for each other. Not to condemn one another, but to help one another. That's what I did. That's what I want you to do. Condemnation is exactly what Jesus said not to do. So how should we do it? When we see somebody that it's overtaken with some kind of a sin, how are we to judge? Well, God gave us a verse for that one too. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1. Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, concerning yourself, or considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Matthew 7:1 says, judge not. Galatians 6:1 says, this is how to judge. This is it. When you see someone who's overtaken with sin, when you see somebody who has fallen, when you see somebody who is living in a way that God said not to live, judge them. But this is how you do it. Restore them in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. With proper judgment, there's a spirit of gentleness that comes with it. If that spirit of gentleness isn't there when you're judging people, you're doing it the wrong way. There's a good indicator right there of whether you're judging right or wrong. Do you have a spirit of gentleness? He's scum of the earth. Do you feel gentleness when you call them that? No, really. Then you're on the wrong page. You're in Matthew 7:1. You need to go to Galatians 6:1. The spirit of gentleness needs to be there with judgment. That tells you whether or not you're doing it right or you're doing it wrong. It doesn't say to tell them about the speck. It actually tells them to help remove the speck. And be careful lest you also fall into sin. It doesn't say to be careful not to fall into the same sin that they fell into. Condemnation is usually the way people fall. That's usually the sin that we fall into when we judge people. You need to judge with a spirit of gentleness and be careful. Be careful, because chances are you'll fall into the condemnation sin yourself. You'll have a plank, they've got a speck, but you're so focused on the speck in their eye that you don't see the plank in your own eye. Oftentimes, we're not judging, but we're condemning. And in that itself, we've fallen into sin. Godly judgment is a loving thing. It does not turn into bitterness or resentment for the other person. If you're judging somebody and you feel bitterness and resentment towards them, you're in Matthew 7:1, when Jesus said, don't do this. But if you have a spirit of gentleness where you're trying to restore them, now you're in Galatians 6:1, where God tells you to judge them. That's the right judgment. The right judgment carries with it a love that wants to restore somebody and to magnify God in the process. That's righteous judgment. That's how we are supposed to be judging. So when it comes down to the way that we judge, do we do it with condemnation or do we do it with the spirit of gentleness? What's the verdict? What's the verdict? How do you judge? And I'm not the judge of that. You are. How do you judge? A spirit of gentleness or a spirit of condemnation? Because God does tell us to judge, but he also tells us how to judge. And aren't you glad that God did not come to this world to judge the way we often judge? Otherwise, we'd all die and go to hell, because we were worthy to be judged in that way. But God did not come to condemn the world, but to save the world. And he says, I want you to take that spirit of gentleness right there and go out and judge one another. It's okay to judge. Galatians 6:1 version, not Matthew 7:1 version. It's okay to judge, but there needs to be a spirit of gentleness with it. Maybe it's time to look at who we have become before we tell others who they should become. Maybe we should judge what we have going on before we judge everybody else for what they've got going on. I don't know where you sit today as far as judging. But I'm telling you, we need to follow God's word, because as children of God, we need to represent God in the right way. And if we're representing God with condemnation, we are doing exactly the opposite of what he came to this earth to do. That is a huge mistake. Judge not. You will not be judged. Condemn not. But as children of God, we should judge with a righteous judgment, not with a condemning judgment. So, to judge or not to judge? That's the question. And the answer is one or the other. It all depends on how you're doing it. So what's the verdict? How are you judging? Is there a spirit of gentleness with it, or a spirit of condemnation? That reveals all to you. So what's the verdict? Stand with me this morning. Dear Heavenly Father, we do thank you for these